let me first say on the outset, this isn't about busting up unions. We as Republicans, certainly I as an individual, I respect anybody and everybody who works hard to build a better life for themselves and their family. We respect that. It's what we promote. But this really is about closing unsustainable deficits, budgets, getting our debt, getting our states, getting our nation under control. We have to do that. You know, as I went through this campaign, I first of all met a pretty special man, Frank Sprevas, who's taken on a pretty big challenge as well. I think we probably ought to give O'Reilly a pretty big hand as well. And every time I saw him on the campaign trail, he was very consistent. He said, we need to find elected officials that have a good heart, that will adhere to first principles, and they will govern as they campaign. And you know what? Throughout the state of Wisconsin, we found those individuals, and we elected them. And now they're doing that job. They're doing the hard job. And I want to say, first of all, I want to come here to Milwaukee County and want to thank you folks. You know, you're the ones that have tilled the field. There's no way that we could have taken over the state, turned it from blue to red. There's no way that somebody like me, you know, just a guy from Oshkosh, can step out of the private sector without the party structure, without the hard work that you folks have been doing for years. And quite honestly, there's no way that I could have won this election without Milwaukee County delivering 130,000 votes. That was 11.5% of the total votes cast for Republicans. You guys did it here, and I thank you. Wisconsin thanks you. Quite honestly, now the nation thanks you for doing that. So, one of my tasks here, I think, is, you know, obviously my job is in Washington, D.C. And what I've been trying to do is give a little bit of an update. And I've given a couple of these Lincoln Day dinner talks now, the last couple of weeks, and I'm kind of doing it from a good news, bad news perspective. And I learned my lesson, because the first couple I gave the good news first. And I ended the speech with the bad news, and that's just too depressing. So let me start out, I'll depress you first, and then I'll leave on a little bit higher note. But, you know, I'll start out with the bad news in Washington, and it starts out, first of all, by there are still people in Washington, there are still politicians that simply don't understand how urgent our problem is. That's the first thing. Second thing, where's the leadership? You know, our federal government really is run by the President of the United States. He sets the agenda. We look to that individual to be our leader. He's not leading. He just dropped the budget on our desks. But not only this year is going to spend $1.65 trillion that we don't have, but it's also going to add another $13 trillion of debt over the next 10 years. It's simply not leadership. I think one of the things getting to Washington, a rookie senator, one of 100, one of 535. I mean, what can I do? What can I possibly do? At least in the next couple of years here, I've kind of defined my role as looking to identify and then communicate how urgent this problem is. And one of the things I've been talking about is, if you take a look at high unemployment, you know, a sluggish economy, slow job creation, these deficits, out of control spending. To me, as a manufacturer, I've always looked at what's the root cause. What I used to talk about were symptoms of the problem. The root cause is the size, the scope, and the cost of the federal government. That's what we need to attack. Quite honestly, that's what Governor Walker and our legislators attacking. The size and scope of the Wisconsin government. But if you really think about it, look at the angst, look at the anger, look at the battle that's being waged to close what? A $3.6 billion a year deficit. In the federal government, we're closing a $1.65 trillion deficit. Think of the task. Think of the angst. Think of the growling that's going to occur when we start actually trying to address that. So, you're already looking depressed. I've got a few numbers. Stick with me. Stick with me. Let me go through a few numbers. $1.7 trillion. That's the estimate that the Small Business Administration has laid out there for the cost, the annual cost of complying with regulations of the federal government. If you want Exhibit A for overregulation, look at the EPA. Not only are those folks trying to deprive our economy of energy by controlling CO2, but now they're literally trying to write regulations and force farmers to keep the dust within the confines of their own farm. I'm not kidding. They call it fugitive dust. They're trying to regulate. I am serious. They're also proposing to treat a milk spill, because it contains animal oil, like a toxic chemical spill, requiring dairies to have first responding procedures in place, containment procedures. It's hard to make this stuff up, it's true. $16 trillion is the number. That's the amount of money we have spent as a nation battling the war on poverty. I'm sad to report it hasn't worked. Total number of people in poverty is not declining. You know what's happened to out of wedlock birth rates? In 1965, when they first started attacking the war on poverty, out-of-wedlock birth rate stood at 7.5%. Right now it's 40%. Our welfare programs, unfortunately, have destroyed the American family. Social pathology, the culture of entitlement dependency that's destroying this nation. I already mentioned 1.65, 1.4, 1.3, $1.65 trillion. That's the budget deficits for the last 3 years. Our nation's debt now stands at $14 trillion. Relative to our GDP, it's almost 100%. Our GDP is 14.7. And during the campaign, we often talked about trying to prevent America from turning to Greece. You know, when Greece hit their debt crisis, their debt was $412 billion, and about 127% of their GDP. Our debt in relationship, or their debt in relation to the U.S. is only 3%. And of course, when they hit their debt crisis, they had Europe to backstop them. Who's going to backstop $14 trillion? Nobody. So one of the questions I've been asking as I've gotten Secretary Geithner or CBO Director Elmendorf in front of our committees, I'm just asking a simple question. What's a debt crisis going to look like to a normal individual, to a family? I haven't got a good answer yet, but I'll guarantee you it won't be pretty. Because in general, what's going to happen with the debt crisis is it'll push interest rates up. And how that'll affect just the federal government. For every 1% increase in the interest rate, that costs the federal government another $140 billion in deficit spending. So we got to get this under control. But of all the depressing numbers, and this will be the last one, and I'll tell you a little bit of good news. Go look at the U.S. debt clock. That has all kinds of good information that lays out our economic condition. If you look at the unfunded liability reported there for just the top 3 entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, the prescription drug program, $112 trillion. It also reports what the total U.S. asset base is. Small business, household, corporations, $73 trillion. Our unfunded liabilities, the things that politicians have promised the American people, exceeds our total asset base by $39 trillion. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. We better start addressing it. So let's talk about the good news. It doesn't exactly overwhelm the bad, but we got some good news. First of all, the good news is 2010 election. You guys helped make that happen. And it's had an effect. We see that effect in what's happening here in Wisconsin. That's a good sign. Even in Washington, there's little signs that had an effect. The day after I got elected, I got a letter asking me to co-sponsor the earmark moratorium. The Republicans agreed to do that. And even more astounding is the Democrats felt the pressure. I'm not sure they really believe it, whether they really followed through, but they actually voted to also have a moratorium on earmarks. It's a pretty small thing. It doesn't save us much. But it's an important symbol. It's a symbol that these elections matter. If you also remember during the lame duck session, there were 9 Senate Republicans that wanted to vote for that omnibus spending bill. They decided not to vote on that thing because, again, the election had an effect. So I'm pretty realistic, though. Let's face it, we only control 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. So am I particularly hopeful that we're going to really see real spending restraint attached to either the continuing resolution or the debt ceiling limit? I'm not. So what does that tell me? That tells me that as much as we said 2010 was the most important election of our lifetimes, 2012 is even more important. And so we got to work hard. I'm going to work hard. I know you're going to work hard. We have got to make 2012 the most important election of our lifetimes, and we have to have a successful election. We've got to elect allies for Scott Walker, for our legislator, and we need, and I need allies in Washington. So you've got to work hard. So let me just end on a little bit more positive note. I want to talk about freedom. And when I first got into this thing, kind of what got me going was the speech I gave at the Lincoln Day dinner back in Oshkosh last March. And when they asked me to speak that night, I knew exactly what my speech was going to be about. It was going to be about freedom. If you take a look at what's happening around the world now, you take a look at Egypt, you look at Tunisia, you look at Bahrain, I'd like to think we are starting to see the dividend being paid from the enormous sacrifice that our fine young men and women have made in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have no idea what's going to turn out in the Middle East. It's very unsettled. But I think it's a pretty good sign that we see people aspire for freedom. And let's face it, it is only in America. It is only America that sends its young men and women, its sons and daughters, to fight not only for our freedom, but for the freedom of people whose culture and religion really gave rise to our enemies. We don't go and fight for land. We don't go fight for oil. We go and fight for an ideal, something we truly believe in. It's called freedom. So I just want to leave you with a final thought. You've heard me say this in the past. It hasn't changed. What we are fighting for here is our fundamental freedom. And we all have to recognize that this is not somebody else's fight. It's our fight. And this is a fight that we absolutely must win. So God bless our efforts, and may God continue to bless the greatest nation in the history of mankind, America. Thank you.